Right now, my job is to introduce our next speaker, and it's a real pleasure to be to met Richard and to introducing him and his work at Christie's Restitution department. I think you're global head of Restitution. Richard did an MLA here a few years back and speaks fondly of Kellogg. So we're honoured to have him. We'll talk about 40 minutes, and there's lots of time for questions. So please hang on to your thoughts, and we'll have that conversation afterwards. Richard, it's all yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. So my name is Richard Aronowitz, and as you were told, I'm Global Head of Restitution at Christie's. And during this talk for around 40 minutes, I'm going to tell you what that job entails and why hopefully it's so important to the international art market. Before I do, I'm going to give you a little bit of a glimpse into the reasons perhaps why I do the job that I do, and also give you some impression perhaps of why the work that restitution departments in the art market do is so important. I would do if I could change slides, but maybe it's not all. Bear with us. There we are. Thank you very much. So before you on the screen, you see 5 blood red beads. And there are 2 possible identifications one could make of these beads. In the best case scenario, they are indeed amber, which is, for me, a very important substance because it carries memory. As many of you, I'm sure, know, you sometimes find pieces of amber with life trapped inside it, with ancient insects trapped in this resinous substance that's solidified over millennia. So in the best case scenario, those beads are made of amber, which I've always found to be a particularly beautiful substance. In the worst case scenario, if one can put it like that, they're perhaps made of bakelite from the 1920s. So they're either amber or they're bakelite. But irrefutably, probably for all of you, they're fairly anonymous, reasonably quotidian things that don't tell you much about themselves. They just sit there on the screen in front of you. I'd like to change the slide again. Maybe, could you press the next slide? Similarly, perhaps even more so, on the screen in front of you is a knife and fork. They might have silver-plated handles. Certainly the knife has a steel blade. Again, they're fairly prosaic, everyday things. Of course, we all eat with knives and forks. That particular pair tells you pretty much nothing about themselves. It doesn't speak to you about history or identity or memory. It's just a boring knife and fork in front of you. Next slide, please. This is probably even more prosaic looking. This is a very battered notebook with a black cloth spine, cardboard covers that over time have been very knocked about, stained, dirtied. Perhaps slightly more interesting is the torn label on the notebook that has blue writing on it, which is pretty hard to read. Again, I think it probably tells you, the audience in front of me, very little about itself. Can we go back to the first slide, please? However, having said that these items in front of you are quotidian and don't tell you much, essentially for me, they're lessons in why the international art market should have provenance research, should have people looking into the ownership history of objects. Because doing provenance research, attaching former owners' names to paintings or watercolors or drawings, brings stories about these objects back to life and brings stories about the families who might once have owned them and lost them back to life. Similarly, if you can attach ownership to very prosaic looking objects, they can suddenly resonate in a very different way than they might have done a few moments before when you didn't know who once owned them. Those beads were my grandmother's, who was murdered in Shoah in the Holocaust. And they're one of the few things that my late mother was able to bring with her from Nazi Germany as a child in the Kindertransport in 1939. So while for you they may look very prosaic, obviously for me, being the lady's grandson, the former wearer and owner of those beads, still don't know whether they're amber or whether they're bakelite. I've never had them tested. For me, they speak volumes because they once were worn by my grandmother. And there were more of them, and over time, perhaps during the journey from Nazism to freedom in England, for my mother, not her mother, unfortunately, some were lost. But for me, they tell me a story because they're all about the lady who wore them rather than the things themselves. They're about my grandmother Miriam, who sadly perished in the Shoah. But so the lesson perhaps is if you understand the former owner or the former bearer of an object, it can speak to you in a powerful way about history and identity that it might not have done a few moments ago. Can you go to the next slide, please? Similarly, perhaps a little more strangely, as far as we as four brothers understand, our mother came to England in July 1939 with a set of cutlery. And that's some of it. Unfortunately, my dear brother, next brother up, Chris, being a would-be drummer in a rock band in rural Gloucestershire, used to drum with those rather nice knives. The pinging sound of the blades they snapped across the room is something I remember from my childhood. So we had 6 knives, and now we probably have 1. Please. Again, so these were brought from Nazi Germany in July 1939, we believe, to England. You can't see it, but they actually have the initial H on the handles. And my mother's surname, which I carry as well, is Aronowitz. So it wasn't from our family. We believe they were given at some point to her family, and she brought them to England. Can I have the next slide, please? This is one of the most important documents you're going to see probably this week or this month, because it's a diary written during the Holocaust, not as a memoir after, but it was written by my great uncle, my mother's uncle, the brother of her late mother, called Izzy Aronowitz. And you can see here it says Tagebuch Diary 2 by Aronowitz. And that was written in 2 Nazi labor camps between the autumn of 1940 and December 1943. 2 very obscure small labor camps east of Berlin in Brandenburg. They were set up for Nazis to employ Jewish forced labor to build the Reichsautobahn. And the idea was to build the Autobahn from Berlin through to Russia, if they could conquer Russia, right through Poland. And he was one of the workers he elected to leave the Litzmannstadt ghetto in Poland to go and work in these 2 labor camps. And miraculously, he survived the ghetto, 2 labor camps, Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and this pendant camp, Manstein, the death march. And separately, the diary survived. And by ways we still don't quite understand, it ended up with my mother post-war and have it up the road in Oxford. It's going to be published next year in Germany. So, the Metropolverlag in Berlin is a big Holocaust literature published. So again, that to you probably looks particularly dull and uninteresting until you understand something about its ownership or its history or what stories it carries. And my point is that what me and my 10 colleagues do at Christie's auction house, and there's a very similar team at Sotheby's where I used to work for 24 years, attach ownership history, what we call provenance, to objects. The more you can attach to a particular object, the more we hope secure you can be that you're not trying to sell an item that is an unrecovered piece of Nazi loot. And fundamentally what my team does for every single lot created before 1945 that we offer at Christie's around the world is to try to be as sure as we can be that no piece is an unrecovered piece of Nazi loot. And that many of you may have read about restitution in the newspapers. It's come to the fore more and more and more over the last 5 or 10 or 15 years, but it was by no means always thus. So I'm going to give you now a bit about the context of how our work began by going back again into history. Can I have the next slide, please? Just to conclude the history bit, I often include a slide of my mother's Kindertransport card. I received that hand-delivered at Sotheby's in 2001. I got a call from the so-called picture counter, where I used to trot down as young specialists to look at works that people brought in off the street for identification and valuation. And I'd written a year or two before to an archive in London, didn't hear anything back, and suddenly I got a call from a lady on the picture counter who said, "Richard, there's a hand-delivered envelope with you." Went down, took it back up to my desk, opened it, and there was my mother. And I'd never seen that photo of her before. I didn't know her home address, which was Nordfriegerstraße, 37, I knew she came from Wuppertal. So those were my earlier efforts in my early 30s, late 20s, to piece together my own family biography, my own history, which fed eventually into the work that I do. It's no coincidence I'm a restitution specialist, because I'd already practiced the art, as it were, on my own family biography. So it was, for me and my 3 brothers, an amazing thing to see that photograph of my mother that we had never seen before. And she was long dead by then, so it was a very powerful thing. Next slide, please. And finally, to move away from myself, I write books on the Holocaust and on stories connected to my mother's family. They're fictionalized, but they're essentially all real. So those 2 novels, before I've written, are about my family history, my maternal family history, turned into fiction. And the diary that you saw a moment ago is Aronowitz's diary. It's featured very heavily in 5 Bs. Every 4th or 5th chapter is actually my transcription of his diary 20 years ago. The sections that I found most powerful and telling. Next slide, please. So as I said, I'm sure by now in 2023, many of you are very well aware of the looting of art during Nazism, the forced sale of art during Nazism, efforts that were perhaps made post-war to try and locate caches of looted art and return it to countries where the objects were lost in or forcibly sold in, and then to rescue to surviving family members. But your awareness, if you have it, is by no means a particularly old thing. I began working in the international art market, as I said, at Sotheby's in 1997 as an impressionist and modern art specialist, fairly freshly out of the Courtauld Institute in London. So I was and still am purely an art historian of a sort. And because I was a youngish cataloguer in the impressionist and modern art department, I was charged with researching often pretty high-end works that the auction house wanted to sell, whether in New York or London or elsewhere. And I was very involved in cataloguing them for sale. And that involved looking through often every single book that our library held on any particular artist, whether it's Picasso, Manet, Monet, Degas, Matisse, whoever. I combed through bibliography on artists' works. And I combed also through old auction catalogues, whether they were Sotheby's or Christie's or Bonhams or Phillips or wherever. And what struck me particularly, and I found particularly engaging, was looking at catalogues from the 1970s or 80s and 90s and seeing all these names that to me struck me as Jewish names in the cataloguing of the works that had been sold 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago. And I always sat there wondering who on earth were these people in Arles or Paris or Vienna or Düsseldorf or Berlin? What happened to them? And what happened to this work that Christie's or Sotheby's or Bonhams or Phillips catalogued all those years ago? And the thing is, no one thought anything about it. No one paid it any attention. Similarly, museums could own with complete impunity, essentially, anything that had been looted from a Jewish family, or indeed, in some cases, a non-Jewish family during the Third Reich. And there was nothing anyone could do to get them back. Gradually, in the 1990s, various historians, such as Jonathan Petropoulos, Hector Feliciano, Hubertus Czarnin, Lynn Nicholas, who was educated here at Oxford, began to write very important monographs, both on the fate of art during the Third Reich and on the fate of art collectors. So there was an awareness building And then various key things happened which perhaps allowed a momentous sea change to take place. One was the advent of the internet, which allowed people to search for information online, and another was the collapse of communism, which opened up archives that had previously been behind the Iron Curtain. So there was a sort of confluence of things. And there'd been other claims, Swiss banking claims, insurance claims, gold bullion claims. A lot of movement had taken place in the 1990s. Jewish lobby groups had been campaigning to get some compensation from the Swiss or from the Germans. So there was a real momentum building. I often use this slide to give you a sense of the scale of what the Allies faced immediately after the cessation of hostilities in 1945 in terms of locating caches of looted art. You can, I hope, see here one lone GI dwarfed by stacks and racks and crates have recently recuperated looted art that they brought in this case to a church in a place called Ellingen in Germany, just to give you a sense of scale. So it's true to say that from 1945 until the early 1950s, vast efforts had been made, and I'm sure some of you have heard of the Monuments Men and Women, a band of Allied servicemen, mostly with art history backgrounds, who were tasked by the Allies to form a unit to comb the fabric of what had been Nazi Europe, looking both at key monuments to see what condition they were in after the ravages of the Third Reich and the war, but also to look at caches of looted art. And then they were brought to various centres, such as the Munich Central Collecting Point, which you'll see in a moment. Books and manuscripts were taken to a place called Offenbach in Western Germany. There were various centres where recuperated, recently discovered caches of looted art were brought for processing and identification. Next slide, please. This is the Munich Central Collecting Point. This grand, I suppose, 19th century edifice. And I always find these pivots of history fascinating. And until Germany fell, and Nazism was defeated in Europe, that building used to be the Führerbau. So this was Hitler's headquarters in the south. And of course, Munich was no bit part player in the mighty Nazi apparatus. It was one of the epicenters of it. It's where Hitler had lived. So that building was a great force for evil that became pretty much overnight after the end of the war the place where the Allied monuments men and women did their work, bringing newly recovered caches of looted art for sorting, to assess the condition of the pieces, for identification, trying to work out who they were by, and perhaps most crucially, where they'd been lost in or forcibly sold in, which was, as you can imagine, often the very hardest part. Can you have the next slide, please? This is them going about their work. It wasn't all men, there were also women. They're often referred to as the monuments men, but there were women in the unit as well. And you're talking about perhaps a couple of hundred people, and that work went on from 1945 until roughly 1951. And as I said, their job was to identify the works, check their condition, and then try and establish which country they'd been removed from by the Nazis, and then repatriate them to that country for the local governments to then try and track down surviving family members to return them. And that's often where the system broke down for understandable reasons, because families had been displaced after 6 years of war and 12 years of being persecuted.
How many did you say were?
About a couple of hundred men and women. Yeah. So it was by no means a large outfit. And that effort went on until the early 1950s. Next slide, please. Some of you may or may not have seen this film. I must admit this was directed by George Clooney. I must admit I haven't yet seen it, because I did try once on a plane, and I watched the first 10 minutes, and it was a strange mashup between MASH and Dad's Army. It was treated in a very, very light way. And for some reason at the time, because I'm quite high-minded, I think I was put off by its tone. But what it did do is bring to a much wider audience the work of the Monuments Men and Women, which is great. So one day I'm sure I'll get around to watching it. Next slide, please. So, the previous slide, the poster for the Monuments Men, was the end of one what, 6-year or 7-year period of effort. That film documented the work of the monuments men and women in their huge effort to get back millions upon millions of objects looted from Jews and from museums, particularly from Jews, during the 12 years of Nazism. They did a great deal. They got back and they restituted countless objects, but only a fraction, of course, of what had been taken or forcibly sold. And then, of course, other imperatives took hold: the rebuilding of a war-torn Europe, the rebuilding of economies, the rebuilding of nation states. The loss of art, compared to the loss of life, was obviously a tiny minuscule of the suffering that Jews went through during the 12 years of Nazism. So, to my perspective from 2023, it was largely forgotten about after the 1950s. There were, of course, Jewish families who were quietly looking, with often very little success before the internet and for social media and mass media that we have now. There were families who did try to get things back, put adverts in newspapers or in art journals to look for objects their fathers or mothers had lost, but often with very little success. So when I was sitting at Sotheby's as a young Impressionist and modern art specialist, looking at these Jewish names in auction catalogues from before the Second World War, I perhaps wasn't alone in thinking about this sort of thing in that way, but it was by no means a prevalent attitude. And then suddenly, in 1998, a man I spoke to only yesterday, called Ambassador Stuart Eisenstadt, was commissioned by the Clinton administration to convene a conference in Washington, D.C. to discuss nation states' current attitude towards unrecovered Nazi looted art. It was an absolute epiphany for the art market and for the museum world. And as I said, it happened in Washington in late November, early December 1998. 44 countries sent emissaries, diplomats, cultural attachés, ambassadors to attend and speak at the conference. I wasn't there, but as I understand it, it was quite a dry, statement by statement series of discussions on, Russia's attitude to unrecovered Nazi loot, or Canada's or France's. But for me, and I think for the world, the biggest achievement was these 11 so-called Washington principles that Ambassador Eisenstadt led the drafting of. They're not laws, they're simply moral, ethical codes that the international art market and museum world is expected to adhere to and abide by. And that's why Christie's and Sotheby's and one or two smaller auction houses have restitution departments, why they employ people like me to live up to the moral force of those codes. And you can see that number one is art that had been confiscated by the Nazis and not subsequently restituted should be identified. And that probably tells you quite boldly, quite plainly, why Christie's has a restitution team. And again, number three is resources and personnel should be made available to facilitate the identification of all art that had been confiscated by the Nazis and not subsequently restituted. And that's quite a simple way of putting it, but what we do, essentially, is before every single work that was created before 1945 is offered by Christie's, our job is to try and be as sure as we can be that none is an example of unrecovered Nazi loot. Whether the thing was sold between one family and another family, or one family via a dealer between 33 and 45, or whether it was looted down the barrel of a gun. And the buck absolutely stops with my team, and it's our duty, as far as we can, to live up to the spirit and moral force of those principles. And number 8 is if the pre-war owners of art that is found to have been confiscated by the Nazis and not subsequently restituted, or their heirs can be identified, steps should be taken expeditiously to achieve a just and fair solution. And in my world, just and fair solution is a key part of the language of the Washington Principle, as I'll explain in a moment. So this is the set of precepts that I and my team work to, and Sotheby's restitution team and others work to. There are far too few of us. You can probably count on 4 hands the amount of people in the international art market that do full-time what I do. There should be more, but at least there's that. Museums across the world, again, have far too few researchers. The UK only has 1 full-time provenance researcher looking at art Aronowitz-Mercer is 1. Victoria Novel Museum, and one or two others who do it alongside other work, but far too few. Next slide, please. So the Washington Conference in late 1998, a year after I began in the international art market, was a complete sea change, and it made the world wake up to the fact that for decades, the international art trade had been selling unrecovered Nazi loot without blinking an eye. And museums had held, since the Second World War, countless objects with Nazi-era taints that hadn't been properly looked into at all. We at Christie's, as I said, look at every single pre-1945 work that is uniquely identifiable. We would have more problems, say, with the first edition, or a book by Charles Darwin, of which there are 1,000 copies. But any original work of art or uniquely identifiable tapestry or sculpture we look at. We're looking at both the object itself, checking the description of the object against a whole array of databases of unrecovered Nazi loot. And we're also, of course, looking at the known ownership history of the object itself. As our colleagues catalogue these things for sale, we're going in remotely, looking at the ownership history, the provenance that our expert colleagues build up, and often suggesting other avenues to try and flesh out what they know, or what the literature on the artist has published. So it's a dialogue between us as restitution specialists and expert departments cataloguing works of art for sale, whether it be old masters, impressionist and modern art, European painting, sculpture, everything we cover that was created before 1945. There are things we don't look at, like wine, because we can't know one Chateau Lafite bottle of red from another, or a vintage motor car, but generally anything that's uniquely identifiable, we are involved in vetting before it gets into an auction. And the attempt is that we don't let anything through in an ideal world. But of course, we're only as good as the information published on the internet and in books. So it's not an exact science. Some families haven't got round yet to recording their family's losses, or they're not even yet aware of them. But given the data we have access to, we do a reasonably secure job. These are examples I'm now going to show you of things that we identified, or my colleagues identified, during that vetting process in the spirit of the Washington Principles, to give you an idea of how it works in the real world. Because you have the moral, ethical language of the Washington Principles. This is then reified into real objects and how we resolve unrecovered Nazi looting. This was a very, very beautiful Van Gogh watercolor, as you can see, which was offered for sale in 2021 at Christie's in New York. Before my time, I only began in Restitution at Christie's in March 2022, having done that job at Sotheby's for many years. So I'm a relative newcomer. My colleagues were doing their due diligence work on that beautiful watercolor, looking into its ownership history, looking at databases. And they discovered two things. One, that it belonged to a Jew from Berlin called Max Majewski, and two, that it later belonged to a French Jewish collector called Alexandrine de Rothschild, and you've all heard of the Rothschild family. So already, when my colleagues in the literature on this painting discovered these two pre-war Jewish owners, their antennae went up, and they began investigating Max Majewski more, and found that he was a Jew who fled in the later 1930s from Berlin, fearing for his life, to Paris, where he then sold that work. Definitions of forced sale have evolved even during my 17 years in this role. That now is generally regarded as a forced sale because the man fled for his life as a Jew from Nazi Germany, sold that object, probably among others, I don't know the full story, to survive on it while he was in France. So that, we examine now cause. Why did this Jewish man, Max Majewski, sell that object? In this case, it was because he was fleeing from Nazi Germany as a Jew. He sold it by a dealer to Alexandrine de Rothschild. And you all know that the Germans invaded in the spring, early summer of 1940, invaded France, northern France. And one of the first things they did in any newly invaded country, is look for art that they could pilfer and loot and seize. And it wasn't just about enrichment of the Nazi Reich, although of course it was that as well, and it was the enrichment of certain Nazis' collections, such as Goering and Hitler, that is proposed Führer Museum in Linz in Austria. But it was much more than that. It was also a very, very carefully crafted and thought through mechanism of attack, persecution. If you own something and someone comes and steals it from you, you both lose something of yourself if you have emotion invested in that object, but it also takes something away from you might be able to sell, as Max Malowski did when he took the Van Gogh to Paris. You have one less lifeline if you're a persecuted Jew who's trying to survive. So it wasn't just about enriching the Nazi coffers or about enriching particular Nazi collections, it was also about persecution. So the looting of art was one of the key mechanisms. Alexandrine de Rothschild had her entire collection also looted by the body called the IRA, the Einsatzstab Rosenberg. Rosenberg not being a Jew in this case, but a German Nazi who formulated the persecution of Jews in his Institute of the Jewish Question based in Frankfurt. His task force, the IRA, was the one tasked with looting in occupied France and Belgium, particularly France and Belgium. So that was looted, that was once sold by a Jew under duress, fleeing for his life from Germany, once looted from a Jewish collection in Paris. And you can imagine we couldn't allow that to be offered for sale without addressing these two very dark parts of its history. It was owned by an American family called the Cox family, and they agreed, my colleagues, to open a dialogue with the Max Malowski heir and the heirs of Alexandrine de Rothschild. And in the end, it was subject to a tripartite settlement. And I mentioned earlier the just and fair solution in Clause 8 of the Washington Principles. Just and fair, usually in the art market, means a financial settlement between a set of claimants or more than one set of claimants and the current owner of the work. So in this case, there was a tripartite legal agreement between three families, between the Cox family, who were the consignors to Christie, the heir of Max Malowski and the heirs of Alexandrine de Rothschild. And then when the item was offered for sale, it could be offered for sale free of any remaining taint. It was all enshrined in a legal document, but it meant that good title could be conveyed from our consignor, the Cox family, to our buyer. So in real world terms, that's the sort of thing we do pretty much on a weekly basis. Can I have the next slide, please? Not everything, of course, is multi-millions of dollars like that Van Gogh watercolor was. Some objects that we discover are very, very humble, but equally important because they tell us very powerful stories about the fate of Jews during the Third Reich. This is a late medieval carved wooden box, as you can see. But again, when my colleagues in the restitution team were doing their due diligence, they discovered that it once belonged to the illustrious Goldschmidt-Rothschild family. And it was seized from that family by the tax office near where they lived. Because another very common tactic by the Nazis was to tell Jewish families they owed the Reich punitive taxes, which had been invented by the Nazis as yet another form of attack. And in order to pay the taxes, the family then had to give up some of their assets to settle the newly invented tax burden that they were had levied against them. And that's an example of that. Again, when my colleagues discovered this somewhat different version of confiscation, being confiscated by a tax office in Nazi Germany, they had to mediate against a settlement between the Goldschmidt-Rothschild family, descendants of that particular man, Rudolf, who owned it, and the current owners. And nicely there, both sides agreed to give the money to charity. It was a very modest item, as you can see by the estimate range, but still, every outcome can be a little bit different. Next slide, please. Between my roles at Sotheby's, which ended in March 2021, and my taking up my new role at Christie's in March 2022, you can detect a year's gap there for the so-called garden leave. I still had a great interest, of course, in restitution and this world. I watched it from a slight distance for one calendar year. And something, to me, very remarkable happened in that, which was the restitution to a set of heirs descending from a man called Kurt Gravi, a Jew from Germany, of this marvelous Franz Marc painting, Franz Marc being my favourite artist. It was a hugely important work. The German advisory panel on restitution recommended its return from the Kunstpalast Düsseldorf, as you can see, in early 2022. And why, to me, now observing briefly from the outset, was this so important? It was so important because that painting had been taken out of Nazi Germany by Kurt Gravi and his wife Elsa to New York. And obviously one doesn't think of New York as under the sphere of Nazi influence because it was later on an Allied power, and it was certainly not, it was certainly free of Nazism. Kurt Nelson and her two daughters, her two sons by her first marriage, fled Nazi Germany, made it to New York, and Kurt sold that painting in New York via a dealer in 1940. But the German advisory panel again looked at cause. Why did they sell it? They sold it because they'd just fled for their lives from Nazi Germany. That was the one asset they had. So they sold it to survive after they newly arrived in New York. They'd saved their lives, they had very little money, and had that one asset, and they sold it. That was, again, a huge shift in how one restitution panel, this being the German panel, looked at sales of what we call flight assets. And it really has, just in the last year or two, has changed, shifted how people like me then have to look at cause, how lawyers, how governments, how judges more and more will have to look at causality of a sale by a Jew, even if the sale itself happened in a neutral or safe country. And that's a huge shift from the thinking back in 1998, even the thinking back when I began this work in 2006. Things evolve, and they continue to evolve. And I knew when that decision, that recommendation by the German advisory panel was made, and Kunstpalast Düsseldorf agreed and gave the work back to the Graviers, that it would very much alter the work we do, because now we have to be very mindful of looking very closely into a work's history, even if the Jewish family had made it, say, to Canberra or Los Angeles or London. We'd have to look more and more into why they sold the thing, even if they sold it in those three countries, which adds a whole level of complexity to our already complex work. Can I have the next slide, please? And these, in the last 5, 7, 4 questions, are examples of things that Jewish collectors sold not in a Nazified country, to give you a sense of how complex and nuanced the work is. This was this wonderful winterlit Monet. It was owned by a man called Richard Semmel, who had two sort of X marks against his name after Hitler came to power in 1933, both because he was a Jew and because he was an ardent communist, and even more than that, he was an ardent communist pamphleteer who went around trying to drum up support for the Communist Party as Hitler was declaiming from the Cup. So he had to flee very early with his wife. And he went into Holland in 1933, where he sold off in the summer of 1933 at Frederick Muller Auction House his Impressions to Modern Art collection. Then in the autumn of 1933, his Old Master Paintings collection. And you would think, well, what's the problem with a Jewish man settling briefly in Holland, which in 1933 was a completely free country, it wasn't invaded until 1940. Why would that be an issue? And again, the issue is because this man was a Jew fleeing for his life from Nazi Germany. So all the works of Impressionist to Modern Art and Old Masters that he sold in 2 separate auctions in Holland are now deemed essentially forced sales or duress sales. You have to look at the context. And again, when that issue was discovered, Christie's was part of a group of people, the lawyers for the Semmel heirs, the owner family, who mediated a settlement. So some of the proceeds of the sale of the painting went to the Semmel heirs, not just to the family that consigned it to us. Next slide, please. Out of all the examples I've shown you, and out of all the examples I've ever come across, this stretches the definition of duracell perhaps to the very remotest degree. I also particularly like him, Bob. So this is a very fine little Manet painting that Christie's offered for sale in the Getty sale in November 2022 in New York. I like the little cheeky chap. And my team liked it so much. They had little versions, or made them either on coasters or little woven pictures, which we have on our walls. It's a very sweet little picture. But it was owned by a lady called Estella Katzenillenborgen, which is a name I've always loved because it means cat's elbow. Estella Katzenillenborgen. You'll see she came from Berlin, where she had lived with her husband, from whom she then separated and divorced. She fled to the sunshine of California from Nazi Germany, from Berlin. And she managed to take that painting with her. And more than that, she had it in America after she arrived there in the late 30s until at least March 1945. However, we couldn't prove that she'd retained it until the cessation of hostilities in May 1945 in Europe. So the lawyers acting for the Katzenillenborgen heirs said, well, you haven't showed us that she kept it till the end of the Second World War. We argued that even though she arrived in the late 30s and kept it with her for 6 or 7 years, ultimately the cause was she needed money because she was a refugee from Nazi Germany and sold it, even if there was a huge time lag between arrival and sale. In that case, a very small portion of the sale proceeds, under the spirit of the just and fair cause of the Washington Principles, went to the Katzenelnborn heirs. But that's the furthest I've ever seen the definition of a duress sale stretched, the causality, the reason for the sale stretched to 6 or 7 years after the arrival of the Jewish collector in America. Next, and I think final slide. This was one I personally worked on. Given my position in the auction house, I tend to do a lot of talks or travelling to meet heirs and lawyers and attend public events. I don't do so much of the research these days, which I miss, because ultimately that's where the grounding of the work all is in the research. But I did do some of this. This is quite a humble little Max Liebermann, himself a Jewish artist, very important German post-impressionist painter, one of my favourites, of the street in the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam in 1905. But again, it was a very complex, particularly nuanced piece of research in history, because this painting was owned by 2 successive Jewish families. It was owned by the legendary Cassira family, Alfred Cassira being related very closely to the Jewish Berlin dealer Paul Cassira. Went to his daughter as part of her inheritance from him. And then there was a forced sale in the earlier, I think in 1936, between the estate of Alfred Cassira and Robert and Ilse Neumann, who then sent the painting into Switzerland, thinking it would be safe there. And it was safe there, it went through successive Swiss dealerships and collectors. But again, we had to look at the transfer between the Cassira family and the Neumann family, even though the Neumanns were themselves Jewish. Why did the Cassira family sell? They sold again under duress. They sold to the Neumann family, who sent the painting to Switzerland. Again, they sent the painting to Switzerland because they needed money as Jews in Nazi Germany. So there were 2 exchanges which were problematic. And the poor American collector who owned the painting and had consigned it to Christie's waited it for a full calendar year while we attempted to unpick the history of this work and resolve the unresolved Nazi irritations, which was then, as I said, 2 forced sales, 2 duress sales, one by the Cassira family and one by the Neumann family. And again, that painting was sold in June in London with a tripartite settlement in place to lift the Nazi retainers from the 2 1930 sales. I think that's the conclusion of my slides. Yes. So we've got 15 minutes for questions. Yeah.
That was really sort of powerful, and it's a tribute to the hard detective work you've been doing and the Christians you've been doing. We have lots of questions, but we wouldn't mind using the mic so we can record them. Let's start. Someone you had your hand up first, please. Yeah.
Yes, I can understand a document which is a bit of a wish list, a bit of guidance. What I don't quite understand is what's the legal framework because there must be a legal framework on top of that.
There isn't.
Okay, well then I've just got two questions from that. You could have a whole set of circumstances that arise in, say, the Second World War.
Yes.
That artwork could be in the family or somehow get into a family for a period of time.
Yes.
It could be sold in market over. It could be so that under domestic law it's property transfer.
Yes. Yeah.
It could be used as collateral for a later family's finances and so on.
Yeah.
What I don't understand is what is the obligation on the person, say, in the 1990s to comply with that framework, because they might have their own ethical view about what's happened.
That's true.
And secondly, it's so wide and vague with moral.
The just and fair. Yeah. Yeah.
How on earth would you decide who got what? So there are two elements. One, where is the legal obligation?
Yes.
And secondly, how on earth does something as airy-fairy as that document? How
How does the world of law and legal ownership and moral, ethical Washington codes interface? You're essentially asking. You're quite right to ask that. We as restitution specialists in the art market and the legal colleagues we work with, because much of the documentation that we need to do is done by our lawyer colleagues, always acknowledge, of course, the good faith ownership or the good title that current owners have.
Yeah.
I mean, the events of loss took place 85 or more years ago. So almost invariably, in most jurisdictions, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a historian, the current owner has good title and usually owns in complete good faith. It's probably not true in America, where you can't acquire good title from a thief. However long ago the event of theft of whatever sort took place, you can't own it legally now. In most other jurisdictions you can. In Germany, if an object has been through one public sale, you are the good faith purchaser and have good title. However, there are sort of parallel worlds going on. One world is the good title, good faith purchaser stroke owner, and the other world is the world of the Washington principles and the moral ethical force of them. And how they come together essentially is that you can't force any private owner to give anything up. If you own something on your bedroom wall or in your sitting room, the Washington principles will essentially have no force. However, how we can operate or we can work and we can find solutions is when a private owner interacts with the art market. They come to Christie's or Sotheby's or wherever because they want to liquidate the value of the object they have. They interact with us because they usually want to sell. And then it's then that we usually discover the historical unresolved taint, and then we can apply the moral ethical force of the Washington principles, and we can do that because no one would ever buy the object while the taint hadn't been resolved or lifted. It's on lostart.de, the German governmental database, or it's on its French equivalent, or it's registered in Poland as a lost. No buyer would ever buy that object with the taint still in place. No auction house would ever allow it to be sold. So of course you can own the Monet, have it on your bedroom wall, and the Washington principles would have no impact on you. If you brought it to Sotheby's or Christie and wanted to sell it, we wouldn't sell it to you. So you're caught in a difficult position.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The other thing that occurred to me is that you've got this moral imperative in that particular document.
Yes.
But you've got a huge inconsistency with many of our museums.
Yeah, of course.
Looted, stolen.
Yes, but don't forget, I only do Nazis and Jews.
Yes.
I don't, I once gave a talk at Sotheby's Institute of Art, which I used to do a lot, to their new ME intake each year. There was a week-long induction program. And I had thought quite a compelling talk for an hour. And then there was a huge banked auditorium at Birkbeck, because there was two little spaces at Sotheby's Institute. And then after my hour-long talk, one lady stood up towards the back, and we just see her up there saying, "Mr. Aronowitz, I thought today you said you were going to talk to us about restitution." And what she meant is, why are you only privileging Nazis and Jews?
Yeah.
And I had to explain, well, that's what I do for a living, I'm paid to do. Of course, it's as old as time. You know, when someone invades, one power invades another, they lose. So of course I acknowledge that. But those Washington principles are essentially all about that. Although Ambassador Isaac, who drafted them, is talking for us at Christie's, New York on the 5th of October. And we had our pre-panel prep last night. And he was talking about the ripple effect of what he drafted back in 1998, encouraging the world now thinking about post-colonial issues and that sort of thing, which is growing and growing and growing. So it's a good question.
It becomes quite interesting.
We should really move on to other people's talk. I'm so sorry, because there are lots of other questions. Thank you very much. Please catch Richard afterwards. Lots of hands that were who'd like to ask a question next. Thank you, yes, yeah.
With apologies, I'm also going to move away from Nazi rooted art. It's sort of a double question. To what extent do you work with the Art Loss Register? And what would be your reaction to the Art Loss Register approaching Christie's after a sale with proof that something they had sold had in fact been stolen?
We, of course, work with the Art Loss Register extremely closely because they vet every single thing that Christie sells. So we do our own due diligence work in-house, and then we pay, as much of the art world does, pay the Art Loss Register to check the objects again against their own proprietary database. Because that's the one database the art market doesn't have access to. It's not like Lost Art DE, which is a governmental database you can go and look at. No one apart from the people who work at the Art Loss Register and their researchers can go into their database. So we pay for them to do a sort of belt and braces process where we've done what we can internally with the databases that are available to us, and then they check everything again. And we hope, of course, between us and them not to allow things through. Of course, it does happen now and then. We would have to take, if they came to us, whether it be 1 week or 1 month or 1 year or 5 years after the event, we'd have to take it seriously and address it.
Could I possibly have your email address?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Brilliant, thank you. A question here, please.
Thank you. My father-in-law also arrived in this country with cutlery spoons in his case. I wanted to ask, so I have thought and read about this quite a lot from my family background, but there's always been one area sort of particular kind of concern, which is the way in which artworks now move out of what is effectively a public sphere into private ownership.
Yeah.
So when you looked at the Kunstmuseum Düsseldorf,
Yes.
you're going from something that's available for everyone to see into private hands. So I wondered what your view was on that. And the second thing I wanted to ask was about the broader issue of restitution. Obviously, what you work on is very specific.
Yes.
But are you surprised that museums haven't taken up more of the opportunity to do provenance research than
in a broad way?
In a broad way, yes.
I'm not sure I'm surprised. I'm sad, I suppose. Disappointed.
Yeah.
Not surprised, no. As I said, most, there are how many auction houses are around the world, from 1 or 2 man outfits to 50 or 100 people. They usually plead lack of personnel or expertise or money. And museums the same. They say that, I suppose, that it's very cost intensive to employ provenance researchers and train them up and have to find the right people. That's usually their defense. But my feeling is, I've been in this particular sphere for the last 17 years, an awareness of looting, forced sales, provenance research and restitution is growing and growing and growing. So if museums, which you seem to be talking about, don't do enough, I don't imagine that can go on forever, put it that way. I think they'll have to eventually address these issues, whether they're Maori artifacts or Ethiopian cuttings of hair or whatever it might be. There are countless different examples. I think that people can't hide behind the convenience of nationhood or history or whatever forever. And the other question was about moving from public to private. I can see that it's a difficult thing to accept, but as someone who's deeply embedded in this world, I would say for me personally, it's more important that families get back what they lost. And they don't just get back what they lost, they often get back the stories that they've been raised about their family. And what's particularly powerful and important for me, it's true that we have work that we do, when a work is settled ahead of a sale, we can then write about the family in the catalogue and tell their story. And often they themselves didn't know the full extent of their grandfather's or grandmother's or great-grandfather's great-grandmother's fate or history. I've met Texans ex-army guys who run, electronic companies on a ring road in Dallas, who until they were contacted by the Dutch government, maybe in 2005, didn't even know they were Jewish. Had no inkling that their grandmother and grandfather were Jews from Berlin and Amsterdam. Grandmother survived and fled to the US. They were sort of camo wearing sort of truck driver types. Lovely people, they had no clue. And if you can reunite those people with their past, I think it's hugely powerful, and you do that through that sort of work. So for me, the telling of stories, and mostly for the families, the telling of stories is the most important thing. Not least because even if you have $1 million painting, if you're 35 heirs, okay, it's great. It's not like you're all going to the bank with wheelbarrows of cash. It's usually about the emotive power of the history you've recuperated, in my experience. Yes?
I wondered if you had any idea of what provision has been made for potential looting in theatres of conflict like Ukraine and other theatres.
A very good question. I don't know. I do know a man called Konstantin Akinci who curated an exhibition which began rather ironically at the Thyssen-Bornemisza Museum in Madrid late last year, and managed to bring out of Ukraine some of its most important museum holdings of modern Ukrainian art. So he very cleverly organised an exhibition with 2 colleagues, which my department then sponsored the book, stroke catalogue for. So I thought it was a very important thing he was doing. He was one of the sponsors there. Not the exhibition, but the catalogue that went with it. He brought out of Ukraine to save them from potential destruction modernist works that he's then touring the world with, going to Germany and coming to the UK and various other centres. But I mean, I don't know the full extent of the effort. There's Blue Shield, there are all sorts of organisations that defend cultural property. And there's a modern version of the Monuments Manual that do that sort of work as well. So there are units attached, say, to the US Army that do this sort of work for current conflict zones.
What does Christie's or Sotheby's have an obligation to disclose the provenance? So the research that you've done, which shows that perhaps it came from a distressed sale, does Christie then have to disclose
It's all clearly laid out in the catalogue now.
Yeah.
And more than that, even if a work was restituted post-war, if there are gaps in its ownership history in old versions of its cataloguing, part of our job is, even if we've reassured ourselves that the work was returned and restituted, if, say, the 1933-45 ownership history has never been published before, our job is to fill it in and publish it, to make the document as complete as possible.
And would that be true if the painting was not finally sold to Christie's?
Well, we wouldn't be involved in the catalogue.
No, but if somebody had offered it to Christie's, found out that there was a tainted history, and then decided they didn't want to put it up for sale, would the research then be public?
Well, I don't know if we could enforce that. I can't see any logical way of enforcing that. Certainly, we would try and explain the history to the owner, but we wouldn't have any jurisdiction, as it were, to use it in a very loose sense, not legal sense. We wouldn't have any jurisdiction about what they chose to do with that information. Certainly, it's horrible if you... Well, I'll give you one final story. I spent 2 years, a few months, researching a very, very beautiful Baron Otherkamp painting in my old life at Sotheby's, which turned out to have been in a 1934 fire sale or forced sale by a Jewish man called Bernhard Albert Meyer, who fled Nazi from Mainz in Germany. He was heading the Jewish community to Argentina. He survived, his family survived. But he had this whole sale of all his collection. I got a Jewish collector in Buenos Aires to track down his heirs. We paid this man to track down this set of Meyer heirs in Argentina. The whole process took months and months and months. The work had been consigned to Sotheby's by a Dutch foundation, a private foundation. We couldn't offer it for sale because it had been on this Nazi-era forced sale. I pieced together all the history. We contacted the Meyer heirs. They were amazed to hear from us because they'd just begun thinking, as it happened, about their grandfather's collection. And were amazed. Suddenly, I sent them an image of one of the paintings in that catalogue. Anyway, the process went on 2 years. They got a lawyer. The Dutch family foundation got a lawyer. They mediated settlement. The foundation paid them out. Decided to keep the painting. That was probably in about 2015. 2 years later, one of my colleagues went to the Masterpiece Art Fair in Regent's Park and saw that very painting in a marquee on sale with a dealer. The provenance has all been resolved, the ownership history had been resolved. All it said was on the label, artist name, title of work, dimensions. Nothing about all that history that I've spent months and months and months uncovering. So you can't enforce these things if you don't have.
Would that affect the value of the painting?
Probably not, but for me it has a huge, it leaves a huge deficit.
I really think we should stop very quickly.
Yeah. I was interested in your story about leaving, and I just wondered, in the process of looting, where did the Nazis come across artists painting by Jewish artists? Did they just destroy it?
Well, that wasn't looted, that was in huge duress.
Yeah, that went through.
Very good question. I don't know enough about that to tell you. Certainly they destroyed so-called exemplars of degenerate art from time to time, although others were sold out of Nazi control to raise funds for the right. I don't think there's any one hard and fast rule. Certainly they couldn't circulate legitimately on the art market after a certain point. That was sold cheaply into Switzerland. But it's a very good question. More work probably needs to be done.
Well, I think with that, as a sort of a conclusion, more work to be done. It's a fascinating combination of detective work and biographical reconstruction, and also really important for understanding our sad 20th century history. So, Richard, it's been a real pleasure to listen to you. A final round of applause. Thank you all very much for coming.